Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Just kidding, I know that we're watching this in class. But anyway, today we are going over some watercolor techniques. The awesome thing about watercolor is that there's so many ways that we can give illusions or make things look just by the way that we paint them. And there's some things that you can actually do to the surface of the paper or just kind of extra tools that you can use to really make some great watercolors stuff. So there we go. So some of the things that we're going to be doing today are making clouds. I'm going to show you guys how to make clouds just by using a paper towel and your paint. We're going to be using some straws. Actually, I will be using one single straw to kind of show you what that effect looks like when you use a straw to kind of blow the paint on the paper. We're going to be going over a salt method, so using salt to create an interesting pattern in the paint. We're going to be using some wet on wet technique, some sgraffito, some spattering, a lot of good stuff. And so hopefully you guys are, in class right now, you have your materials and you're following along. So let's go ahead and begin. Normally what I would do with this kind of situation is I would kind of tape off certain sections or areas of my paper. Right now, I don't really have the tape and it's going to be a little bit more time consuming because we're on kind of a shorter time frame. I'm just going to do this quickly. So what I'm going to do is I have all my materials set up. I have my water, my paper towel, my brush. I have my paints here as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And the first thing that I'm going to start with is the salt method. So basically this is just us putting down some paint and adding some salt to it. And the reason why we're doing this first is because you want to put the salt on the wet paint, but you want to give it enough time to dry. It has to dry completely before you remove the salt and you see the pattern. So I'm just going to go ahead and get my brush wet, and I'm just going to pick a random color, kind of a darker color here. Get a little bit more water. This really pretty blue. And I'm just going to make kind of a nice, not too big of a section because we're going to be using this paper for many different things, right? But just kind of enough of a section to where I'm actually going to see what the salt looks like after I've poured it. Okay, so I'm just going to go through, take some salt, whoop, a lot of salt, and I'm just going to sprinkle that in. You can kind of already see that the salt is kind of picking up the paint in certain areas. So that's essentially what it's going to do. It's going to pick it up. Oh, I think I threw that salt in the trash can, but I probably should have thrown it over my left shoulder. Superstitious. But you can see right now that the salt is actually kind of absorbing that color. And so once it dries completely, it should come out with a really cool pattern. This salt is just Morton iodized salt. So it's table salt. It's really thin. It's really small. If you use bigger, kind of more coarse salt, you're going to get a little bit of a different look. But there we go. All right, so we're just gonna go ahead and let that dry and move on to something else. And since my brush is already wet, I'm gonna go ahead and do what's called the wet on wet technique, okay? And this is basically where you wet your paper first, and then you go through and use the wet paint on top. Now, there's different ways that we can do this. I just have extra salt all over my paper. So there are different ways that you can paint, okay? You can have the dry paper and then paint with the watercolor on top, or you can get the paper wet and then go through and have the wet paint on top of it. And really what it does is it just makes it a lot lighter, okay? So if I have my dry, I'll show you what it looks like when we use, wet paint on dry surface. It's just gonna look something like this, okay? The color is pretty dark, pretty pigmented. Now, if I were to go through and get the paper wet first, okay, it's going to change the way that looks. So I'm just going to wet a small area here and put my paint on top. Okay, the paint, when it's wet, will kind of spread out a little bit more if you have the paper wet and then you're using the wet paint on top. It gives it more of kind of an organic feel. So when you're using the wet paint on the dry paper, it's only gonna stay where the brush has painted. Okay, if you have wet paper and then you use the wet paint on top with the watercolor, what's going to happen is the watercolor is going to go wherever the water was placed. Okay, so you can see that my brush mark was a little bit more organic. We don't have as straight lines, right? It kind of just naturally flows on its own and creates that nice shape. So it's kind of up to you, right? This is what people would say is more of a painterly style. But of course, you'll kind of find your own style as you go through and start painting, right? So we went over the salt, we went over a wet on wet technique, and we also went over a dry on wet technique, right? So the next thing that we're gonna do is we are going to do a little bit of, I will say, wax resist. Now this is a Crayola crayon. It's typically made for a whiteboard, which is very interesting, but we're going to be using it today because it is primarily used out of wax. And so what we can do is we can use this to draw on our paper first, and then we paint over it. And when I say wax resist, it means anywhere where you have drawn with crayon, the watercolor is going to separate and go away from that. So I'm just going to right here do my little signature, what I normally sign papers with. Let's use a different color. So I'm just going to get a little paint on my paintbrush. I already have my crayon down. Of course, you don't have to wait. It's not like the salt. I have some extra crayon here. So let's see. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see with this color. Hopefully you can see it on screen better. I can see it fairly well on my paper, but hopefully you can see that little bit of an outline. Now, this crayon is for dry erase marker, so it may not have worked that well. Typically, if we use regular crayons like we will in class, it should be fine, but you can already kind of tell that there's a little bit of a resist, a little bit of an area where it stays kind of similar to the white of the paper. And there you go. So you can use this to create drawings. You can use this to write things and then build the watercolor on top. Or if you want an area that's just a certain color, right? I'm using white here. White would be very nice to do highlights on things to make them look a little bit more three-dimensional. That's up to you, okay? So next what we're gonna do is we're going to create a wash. Okay, we're going to create a wash. We talked about washes in class a little bit, so this should be somewhat of a familiar territory for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my watercolor pan and I'm just going to go ahead and grab some paint on my pan. Now I've switched over to a flat brush, which is going to be really awesome for those of you that are artists that like to work with these materials at home, or that just want to try some watercolor techniques at home. If you get yourself a flat brush, it is excellent for doing backgrounds. Again, this brush is very large, so it will cover a very large amount of space, which is going to be awesome for those of you that like to work on larger surfaces. And it's just really nice to have variety of brushes. The brush that I typically work with is a round, okay, but different brushes have different purposes, right? So this is going to give me nice clean edges, and it's also going to help me create my wash. Now, when we have a wash, we want less pigment and we want more water. Less pigment, more water. So I'm just going to take my brush, a little bit of my pigment, get it wet, and I'm just going to create a flat wash. So just going across the paper with the flat brush. I understand you guys don't have flat brushes in class with you right now, but that is perfectly fine. So whatever you do have, sorry, that's my dog. Whatever you do have in class, you can use to create that wash. It'll be fine, no worries. Okay, so we did the salt, we did the wash. We can do we did wax resist, and we also did wet on wet. So let's go ahead and we're going to do what's called a graded wash. So this is a wash, it's just one single color. We're going to go ahead and do a graded wash, which is going to be a combination of two different colors kind of mixed together. Now this is really great if you're doing sunsets, if you're doing sunrises, if you're doing kind of like a night sky, or any time when you really want to blend two colors together. It doesn't necessarily have to be a background of some sort. It could really be anything. So what I'm going to do, I want to pick two colors that are going to work good together. Okay, I have this really bright, intense yellow. And I'm just going to lay that down on my paper, get it a little bit wet. So I'm starting with my initial color. I'm kind of adding some water to the page. And while that area is still wet, I'm going to go in with my second color and just kind of blend them together a little bit. I can add a little bit more water to give it a softer tone. And there we go. Okay, so the colors blend very easily. That's one of my favorite parts about watercolor, is that they kind of just seamlessly kind of mesh together. And especially if you have colors that are very similar, you can get a really nice reaction to it. I see that there was some salt here that I didn't take off, so you can see what the salt's doing, right? Kind of funny. Okay, so that is how we do a graded wash. Like I said, it's great for backgrounds. It's great for if you want to do kind of like landscape painting, but there are other ways you can use it as well too, right? You're only limited by your own imagination. So however you want to use these techniques for your watercolor, that is up to you. Okay, we are going to move next to sgraffito. And sgraffito is when you create a design in the paper with a sharp object. I'm just going to use kind of like a thumbtack here because it's got a nice sharp point. And you don't want to go all the way through the paper. So we don't want to see the back side of the paper, okay? With sgraffito, we really just want to create a scratch through the first layer of the paper. Now, I'm working on a watercolor block, which is really nice, thick watercolor paper, and it is all attached to each other so it doesn't buckle as much with the water. So it's going to be very difficult for me to actually scratch all the way through. I probably wouldn't be able to do that. But essentially what we want to do is just scratch the surface. And you can hear those lovely scratch marks. And I didn't really do a very cool design, but there we go. So I have scratched my surface, and now I'm going to take my paint and just go over it. Okay, with the sgraffito, you should be able to see the design that you created within the color, right? So you can see a little bit of that scratching design that I have created, and that's pretty much sgraffito. Okay, so it's going to get a little bit darker in the areas. The pigment of the watercolor is going to soak down into that area where you've scratched, and then you'll see everything else. So that is really cool if you want to do certain designs, if you want to create texture, like if you were doing an animal, you want to create fur or some other type of, you know, fuzzy texture. I don't know. You'll use your imagination. You'll take these techniques and you'll use them for something else, right? So next, we are going to do just kind of blowing with a straw, okay? So I have provided straws for you in class, and all that we're gonna do is really just create a pool of watercolor, and we're just going to use our straw to kind of manipulate where that pool of watercolor is going to go, okay? So I'm going to choose a completely different color. Now for this, we want a nice pool of watercolor, right? So I want a good size bead or dot, and I'm just going to blow onto it and it will move it around. I wanted to kind of do it this way, but I have stuff blocking me. This is really great if you want to do trees, if you want to do some kind of organic long bush or maybe a plant. Very cool. Okay, so we did the salt method. We did sgraffito. We used the straw. We used the wax resist. We did the wet on wet design. We created a wash. We also did a gradient wash. And now what I'm going to show you is just how to do some pickup methods. So when I say pickup methods, I mean we're going to be using a paper towel to kind of pick the paint up off of the paper. And I'm just going to move my paper around just a little bit here so you can see. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to use blue because I want it to resemble or mimic clouds. You don't have to take the whole paper towel, okay? That's a little bit much, but just kind of rip a corner off or a small piece that you can kind of crinkle up a little bit. Once we get that crinkle, you'll see all these little nice edges on it. And that's really what we want when we're creating this, because we want our clouds to look nice and organic, right? So I'm just going to take my blue, and this is kind of a time-sensitive technique. So what I mean by that is we want to put down the color, and then we want to quickly use our napkin to pick up layers of the paint before they dry, right? So I'm just going to take my napkin, and it is going to lift up some of that pigment. If you press down really hard, you're gonna get more white area, right? It's gonna pick up more pigment. If you want some lighter colors, just don't push down so hard, right? And it kind of gives that nice organic feel of clouds kind of waving away in the wind. Very nice, very nice, very easy, right? The things that we can do with just a paper towel when it comes to paint is really awesome. And people always want to know how to draw clouds, and clouds are difficult to draw or paint because they are organic. So using a material that is not a paintbrush will kind of help add to that organic feature of the clouds and will help kind of create those mismatched asymmetrical designs with the clouds.